Welcome to week 4. Hasn't time flown since the beginning of semester? This week we're going to take a serious look at the Linux operating system. There are 3 parts to this week's work: an introduction to Linux, inside Linux, and special folders and the Linux hierarchy. You can see the agenda on the screen now. I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about the first section, Introduction to Linux, because it's pretty interesting, and it's important, I think, that you understand how the free software and Linux came to be. In fact, free software started before Linux, in the middle 90s, in fact even earlier than that. We had a group of people. The major one was a guy called Richard Stallman. You can see from his picture he's a pretty wild guy. Back in the 1980s he looked even wilder. He's sort of tamed down a bit in his old age. But he was adamant and passionate about the concept of free software. And the way he expressed this was to set up the Free Software Foundation and start to work on the GNU or GNU set of software. The idea of this was to provide a basics for Unix, which of course was a proprietary operating system, wasn't free. He wanted a free version of all the bits and pieces that went with Unix. And this was an absolute godsend, of course, 5 or so years later, when Linux came along. Linux was founded by a Swedish-speaking Finn. Part of Finland speaks Swedish. And his name was Linus Torvalds. He's now American. He lives in America as an American citizen now. But in those days, he was doing his Bachelor of Computer Science at Helsinki University in Finland. And he, as part of one of his honours thesis, he did a thesis on setting up a new operating system, and he wrote the first version of Linux. And then the rest is history, as they say, as it became wildly popular at the same time as the internet was founded. So Linux and the internet really grew up together. And Linux being free, free as in beer and free as in speech, that's all explained in the notes, so have a good look at that. It's not just a set of software, it's a culture and a way of thinking that has really become very significant in the software business, particularly in the last 10 years. Initially people thought it was going to be pretty silly, but then the idea of free software, who's going to do free software? But history has proved those sceptics wrong. Okay, the second part of this week's work is inside Linux, and we're going to look at the various commands and ways in which Linux is controlled and operated and configured. And then we're going to move on to a concept of redirection and pipes. This is not just a Linux thing. You'll find this in Windows as well, and most operating systems have some form of redirection and piping. So it's actually not to do with street signs or plumbing, but look at it carefully, try to understand exactly what is happening here, because it's actually very significant in the way in which scripts and things are done in both Windows and Linux, and of course Unix. Then we're going to move on to security, the idea of file permissions and permissions for directories, a very important concept which anybody who deals with particularly Linux and Unix has to face all the time. You've got the same issue, of course, in Windows. If you're running a Windows network, you need security there too, but the way it's done in Windows is a bit different, and we're not dealing with that in this lecture or this week's work. And then the last section is on special folders and the Linux hierarchy. The special folders have to do with Windows. Where does Windows put things in order for the operating system to find them easily? And the same with Linux. It has what's called a Linux hierarchy, the way in which all the directories are set out in Linux and what goes in each directory. So you need to have a bit of an idea of that if you're going to have any understanding of Linux and Unix at all. Okay, so that's this week's work. Don't forget to follow any links that are in the notes because I don't rewrite stuff that is well covered in internet articles, so make sure you follow the links and of course do the test. So I'll see you in the lecture.